September 23, 1932, 11:47 p.m., Al Capone clawed at the wooden coffin lid, 6 feet underground, his fingernails breaking against the rough pine as dirt slowly sifted through the cracks onto his face. 43 minutes earlier, Vincent the Gravedigger Torrino and his crew had thrown Al into this makeshift grave behind St. Alphonsus Cemetery, confident that Chicago's most dangerous crime boss would suffocate in the darkness within the hour. They had counted on Al's panic, his desperation, his human instinct to waste oxygen screaming for help that would never come. What they hadn't counted on was that Al Capone had been preparing for exactly this kind of death trap for 2 years, ever since he'd heard whispers that his enemies were planning something creative for his elimination. The metal object Al pulled from his jacket pocket wasn't just a lighter, it was the key to the most impossible escape in criminal history, and the beginning of a revenge campaign that would make Vincent Torrino wish he'd simply shot Al in the head instead of giving him time to think, plan, and survive the unsurvivable. What made Al Capone's burial the greatest strategic error his enemies ever committed wasn't just that they underestimated his survival skills. It was that they gave him exactly what he needed most, uninterrupted time to plan their complete destruction while the world believed he was dead. To understand how Al Capone survived being buried alive, you need to understand something about his mind that even his closest associates didn't know. Al wasn't just a crime boss who happened to be intelligent. He was a strategic planner who studied every possible way his enemies might try to kill him, and he prepared contingencies for threats that seemed impossible. Being buried alive wasn't just a fear Al had considered, it was a scenario he had specifically planned for after learning that Vincent Torrino had used the method to eliminate 2 rivals in Detroit. Al had spent months studying suffocation, oxygen consumption, soil density, and underground survival techniques. He had even practiced holding his breath and conserving oxygen in controlled environments. When Vincent's crew threw him into that grave, they thought they were improvising a creative execution. Actually, they were walking directly into a trap that Al had been setting for 18 months. But Al's preparation went deeper than just survival techniques. He had been feeding Vincent false information through double agents for over a year, making himself appear vulnerable at specific times and locations. The cemetery burial wasn't a surprise attack. It was the culmination of Al's plan to fake his own death while positioning himself for the ultimate revenge. July 15, 1932, 2 months before the burial. Vincent the Gravedigger Torrino received intelligence that would seal his fate forever. His informant, a man he trusted completely, told him that Al Capone would be traveling alone to visit his mother's grave every Wednesday night at 11 p.m. He goes alone, no bodyguards, stays for exactly 20 minutes, the informant explained. It's the only time Capone is completely vulnerable. Vincent studied the cemetery layout, noting the isolated location, the lack of witnesses, the perfect opportunity for an elimination that would send a message to every crime boss in America. This is it, Vincent told his crew. We don't just kill Capone, we bury him alive. Let him think about his mistakes while the dirt covers his coffin. Let him understand what happens to people who interfere with the Torrino family business. What Vincent didn't know was that his trusted informant was actually Tony Accardo, one of Al's most loyal lieutenants, feeding Vincent exactly the information Al wanted him to have. August 30th, 1932, 3 weeks before the burial, Al Capone reviewed the final details of what he privately called Operation Resurrection. He sat in his office with Frank Nitti, going over every aspect of a plan so complex that even Nitti questioned its necessity. "Boss," Nitti said, studying the elaborate preparations, "why not just kill Vincent and his crew? Why go through this elaborate fake death scheme?" "Because, Frank," Al replied, "killing Vincent would eliminate one rival. Letting Vincent bury me alive and then returning from the dead will eliminate every rival. When word spreads that Al Capone survived being buried alive, no criminal in America will ever again believe that I can be killed by conventional methods." Al opened a specially designed metal briefcase that contained everything he would need for underground survival: a compressed air tank the size of a cigarette pack, a miniature cutting torch, emergency food tablets, and a communication device connected to his organization. "The psychological impact will be worth more than 100 assassinations," Al continued. "My enemies will start to believe that I'm supernatural, unkillable, beyond human limitations. Fear is more powerful than violence, Frank, and nothing creates fear like a man who returns from his own grave." September 10th, 1932, 2 weeks before the burial, Al began his final preparations by testing his survival equipment in a controlled environment. He had his men bury him in a practice coffin for 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours, perfecting his breathing techniques and escape procedures. The key, Al explained to his inner circle, is controlling panic. Most people die from suffocation not because there's no oxygen, but because they waste oxygen panicking. I'm going to use that time to cut through the coffin, create an air pocket, and signal my rescue team. But Al's plan had a second phase that he shared with no one except Frank Nitti. After his resurrection, he would spend 1 week letting Vincent celebrate his apparent death. Then Al would appear at Vincent's headquarters with evidence that would destroy not just Vincent's organization but his reputation, his family, and his sanity. When a man returns from the dead, Al said with that calm smile that made even his allies nervous, people believe he can do anything. And Vincent Torrino is going to learn that some enemies are too intelligent to stay buried. September 23, 1932, 10:30 p.m. Al Capone walked alone through St. Alphonsus Cemetery, carrying flowers for his mother's grave exactly as he had every Wednesday for 6 weeks. He knew Vincent's crew was watching from behind tombstones, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Al knelt at his mother's gravestone, said a genuine prayer, then placed the flowers carefully. As he stood to leave, he counted 4 men stepping out of the shadows, exactly as he had predicted. "Evening, Al," Vincent said, holding a sawed-off shotgun. "Time for your final appointment." Al turned slowly, his hands empty, his expression showing just enough surprise to be convincing without appearing weak. "Vincent Torrino," Al said calmly. "I wondered when you'd find the courage to face me directly." "You're not in a position to insult anyone," Vincent replied. "You're about to find out what happens to people who think they're untouchable." 2 of Vincent's men grabbed Al's arms while the third pressed a chloroform-soaked rag over his face. As Al's vision faded, he heard Vincent's voice explaining what would happen next. "We're going to bury you alive, Capone. Give you time to think about your mistakes while you suffocate 6 feet underground. Let you understand what real power looks like." Al let the chloroform take him, smiling internally as he realized that Vincent had chosen exactly the death method Al had hoped for. September 23, 1932, 11 p.m. Al woke up inside a wooden coffin, feeling the weight of dirt being shoveled onto the lid above his head, the sound of shovels hitting wood, then the duller sound of dirt hitting dirt as his grave was filled. Vincent's voice filtered down through the soil. "Hope you enjoyed your last look at the stars, Capone. Next stop, hell." Al waited until the shoveling stopped, until he heard Vincent's crew walking away, laughing about their creative execution method. Then he began the escape that would become legend. First, Al activated his miniature air supply, giving himself an extra 2 hours of oxygen. Next, he used his compact cutting torch to create a small hole in the coffin lid, allowing dirt to fall in but also creating an air channel to the surface. The most difficult part wasn't the physical escape. It was the psychological discipline required to work methodically while buried alive. Al forced himself to breathe slowly, conserve energy, and follow the survival plan he had practiced dozens of times. Using the cutting torch, Al carefully expanded the hole in the coffin lid until he could fit through it. Then began the slow process of digging upward through 6 feet of loose soil, creating a tunnel just wide enough for his body. The entire escape took 3 hours and 17 minutes. At 2:17 a.m., Al Capone's hand broke through the surface of his own grave, followed by his head, then his body, emerging from the earth like something from a nightmare. But Al's resurrection was just the beginning. The revenge phase would prove that some enemies are too dangerous to bury and too intelligent to underestimate. September 24, 1932, 10 a.m. Vincent Torrino was eating breakfast at his regular restaurant when the newspaper delivery boy dropped off the morning edition. The headline made Vincent's coffee cup shatter on the floor. Al Capone presumed dead missing for 12 hours. Vincent smiled with satisfaction, reading the article about how Chicago police were searching for the missing crime boss. By evening, Vincent was celebrating with his crew, toasting their successful elimination of America's most powerful criminal. "To creative problem-solving," Vincent said, raising his glass. "Al Capone thought he was untouchable. We proved him wrong." What Vincent didn't know was that Al was watching the celebration from across the street, very much alive and planning revenge that would make Vincent's burial method seem merciful by comparison. September 30, 1932, 1 week after the burial. Vincent received a package at his headquarters with no return address. Inside was a photograph of his own tombstone with his death date listed as October 1st, 1932, and a simple note. Some people are harder to bury than others. AC. Vincent stared at the photograph, his hands shaking as he realized the impossible. "Boss," one of his men said, looking over Vincent's shoulder, "how is this possible? We buried him ourselves. He was underground for hours." Vincent dropped the photograph, understanding for the first time that he hadn't just failed to kill Al Capone. He had given Al the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that conventional methods of elimination wouldn't work on Chicago's most strategic criminal mind. October 1st, 1932, exactly 1 week after Vincent's celebration. Al Capone walked through the front door of Vincent's headquarters at exactly noon, accompanied by 20 soldiers and carrying a shovel. The entire room fell silent as men stared at what they believed was a ghost. Al walked calmly to Vincent's desk, placed the shovel on it, and sat down in the chair across from the man who had buried him alive. "Hello, Vincent," Al said with that trademark calm smile. "I believe this belongs to you." Vincent couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing. Al Capone, the man he had personally buried 6 feet underground, sitting across from him as if nothing had happened. "You're wondering how," Al continued. "You're wondering if you're losing your mind, if this is a dream, if I'm some kind of supernatural force that can't be killed by normal methods." Al leaned forward, his voice becoming quieter but more menacing. "The answer is simpler than you think, Vincent. You tried to bury a man who had been preparing for that exact scenario for 2 years. You gave me exactly what I needed, time to plan your destruction while the world thought I was dead." Al nodded to his soldiers who began positioning themselves throughout Vincent's headquarters. "Here's what's going to happen. You buried me alive, so I'm going to return the favor. But I'm not going to bury you in dirt, Vincent. I'm going to bury you in consequences." What followed would become known as the Gravedigger's funeral, the systematic destruction of Vincent Torrino's entire organization over the course of 1 week. Al didn't just eliminate Vincent's soldiers and business operations. He destroyed Vincent's reputation, his family's standing in the community, his political connections, and his sanity. Al's psychological warfare was more devastating than any physical violence. Every day Vincent received reminders that he was being watched, hunted, eliminated piece by piece by a man who had literally risen from the dead. October 8th, 1932, 1 week after Al's resurrection. Vincent Torrino was found in his apartment, catatonic, staring at a hole he had dug in his living room floor. He had been trying to bury himself alive, convinced that being underground was the only place he could hide from Al Capone. Al visited Vincent in the psychiatric hospital where he was committed. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Vincent?" Al asked, looking down at the broken man who had once thought he could eliminate Chicago's most dangerous criminal. "You tried to bury me because you thought I was just another criminal who could be killed like anyone else." Al turned to leave, pausing at the door for his final words. "I let you bury me because I knew that surviving the impossible would make me something more than human in the eyes of every criminal in America. Thanks for the promotion, Vincent. Being buried alive and coming back was the best thing that ever happened to my reputation." Vincent never spoke again. He spent the remaining 12 years of his life in psychiatric care, drawing pictures of graves and repeating the same phrase over and over: "Some people can't stay buried." Al Capone's impossible survival became legend throughout organized crime. Criminals across America began to believe that Al possessed supernatural powers, that conventional methods of elimination wouldn't work on him, that he was essentially immortal. The psychological impact was exactly what Al had planned. His reputation became so complete that rivals preferred negotiation to confrontation, understanding that a man who could survive being buried alive was too dangerous to challenge through normal means. And the grave Vincent had dug for Al? Al bought the cemetery, turned that specific plot into a memorial garden, and installed a plaque that read, "Some mistakes teach lessons, others teach legends." September 23rd, 1932. A man was buried alive, a legend was born, and organized crime learned that the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who refuse to die, they're the ones who turn their own deaths into weapons. If this incredible survival story amazed you, hit that subscribe button. We're telling the Al Capone stories that prove intelligence and preparation can overcome any death trap. Drop a like if you think Al's planning was genius. And in the comments, what would you have done in Vincent's position after discovering Al's was still alive? Turn those notifications on, because next week we're revealing how Al Capone's final confrontation with the federal government became the most legendary legal battle in American history. Remember, in the world of criminal warfare, the deadliest enemies aren't the ones who are hardest to kill, they're the ones who can turn their own murder into the foundation of an even more terrifying reputation.